Let's talk about the criteria for a substance use disorder and how to diagnose a substance use disorder. Now, for some of you, this is going to become second nature because you might work specifically with the addiction population, and so you are pretty regularly diagnosing substance use disorders. And for others, you may not see this a whole lot, and you might have to revisit these criteria every now and then. So what I'm hoping to do in this video is I would like to go through each of the criteria, and then I also would like to describe how do we go about diagnosing once we know which criteria are met. So there are 11 criteria in the DSM-5-TR for substance use disorders. The first criteria is that the substance is taken in larger amounts or over longer periods of time than was intended. So an example of that might be, well, I really only meant to have one drink. That was really my intention, but gosh, I ended up getting really drunk last night. I really only meant to show up and have some drinks at dinner. But then afterwards, I picked up a six pack on my way home and I just kept drinking all the way till I went to bed. So it sounds like in these situations, the person didn't intend to drink that much or didn't intend to drink for that long, but they did anyway. They kind of went over their own boundary. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is there is a persistent desire or unsuccessful effort to cut down or control the substance. So what we might see here is maybe someone who has maybe attempted treatment before and it's been unsuccessful and they've relapsed, or maybe they've attempted counseling before, but they also don't have to have had to have experienced like a structured treatment experience in order for them to meet this criteria. It could have just been, I told myself I wasn't going to drink for the next 2 weeks, but I ended up picking back up that next day and drinking. So there was like an effort to kind of cut down, and then that person was unsuccessful in being able to cut down from the use of that substance. The third criteria is a great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the substance, use the substance, or recover from its effects. So an example of this might be, I really had plans to hang out with my friends last night, but I really had a hard time finding the cocaine that I've been looking for, and I had to go around to like 5 different dealers, and it really took my whole Friday night, and so I wasn't able to hang out with my friends. So this would be an example of meeting this criteria because a great deal of time and effort was spent to obtain the substance beyond just going to one place and maybe trying to get it. Another example of this might be um, that maybe there was a lot of use that happened throughout the week. And so the person spent the entire weekend either in withdrawal or maybe hungover. And so they were not able to participate in anything else that they had going on that weekend. That would be an example of this criteria too, because they spent a significant amount of time having to recover from the effects of the substance. The fourth criteria is craving or a strong desire or urge to use the substance. So this might be an example of this might be it's preoccupying the mind of the person. So, I just can't stop thinking about it. Or I notice that when I'm sitting at work and it's getting to be about like 3 or 4, I start to get this like craving, like I can't wait to get off work so I can grab me a drink. That would be an example of a craving or an urge. So the fifth criteria is recurrent use of the substance is resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, home, or school. So if the use of the substance is getting in the way of home life, you're no longer able to show up and have dinner with your family. You're missing your daughter's soccer games on the weekends. You're having to call into work because you're hungover from the night before. You're saying no to hanging out with friends now so that you can go and use instead. These would be examples of meeting this criteria. The next criteria is continued use of substance despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exasperated by the effects of the substance. So this would be an example of this kind of in a general sense would be that there's been negative consequences for use, but yet the person has continued to use anyway. So, I know that it makes me feel really crappy, but I keep doing it anyway. Or I've had a lot of legal issues. Maybe I've had a DUIs, multiple DUIs, and I continue to use anyway. It's starting to ruin family relationships, and your wife leaves you, but you continue to use anyway. So it's really when we start to see negative consequences start to happen for someone, but that person still is engaging in the substance use. That would be an example of meeting this criteria. So criteria number 7 is important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of the substance use. So an example of this would be, let's say that someone is a regular D&D player, Dungeons and Dragons. So let's say they are a regular D&D player and they've been doing this for a long time. They've got a group of friends that they typically play with, but their use has gotten so bad that they've started canceling on their D&D friends, and now they're no longer showing up in that group to do the fun D&D stuff because they're too busy staying at home and getting drunk or high or whatever it might be. That would be an example of meeting this criteria here. So criteria number 8 is recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. So that would be using to the point where we are putting ourselves in situations where we are physically in danger or we are endangering other people. An example of this right off the top of my head would be driving under the influence. That is a dangerous behavior. It's endangering myself, it's endangering other people. That would be that would be an example of meeting this criteria. Maybe we are an IV drug user, which is very dangerous in and of itself, and maybe we've been sharing needles with someone. That's incredibly physically hazardous, right? So that would be an example of what we would look for this criteria. Criteria number 9. Number 9 is substance use is continued despite knowledge of having persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problems that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the substance. So an example of this might be someone has maybe developed some cirrhosis of the liver and they continue to drink anyway. Or maybe they have consistently had to go to the hospital or experienced health problems because of their use, but yet they've continued to use anyway. I think you might be starting to see a pattern when we have negative consequences, but that use continues. That's usually an issue. Okay, so the next one is, so number 10, our criteria number 10 is tolerance. So we typically are looking for needing to increase the amount that we use in order to have the same effects. So, it's not uncommon for folks to develop some type of tolerance if they're using, but this is one of our criteria for a substance use disorder too, is that we're seeing that significant tolerance that happens. So, it used to take me 4 shots to get drunk a night, and now it takes me 12 to have the same effect. So we're increasing that use, and we're having to increase that use because our tolerance has increased. Criteria number 11, which is the last criteria, is withdrawal. And so there are lots of different withdrawal symptoms that someone might experience, but usually when we're thinking about withdrawal, we're thinking about physiological symptoms that happens when somebody is no longer using. So maybe they have been binging for an entire weekend, and when they stop use, that next morning they wake up and they're sweaty and they're clammy, and maybe they experience, if it's alcohol, maybe they experience a withdrawal seizure. That they're irritable, that this would be more than just what we would call a hangover. This would be more of longer standing withdrawal symptoms that are more severe in nature and are due to that substance no longer being present actively in our body, or we're coming down from it. Still may be present, but coming down from it. And then what we also might see with this criteria is we might see someone take more of the substance in order to relieve that withdrawal. So maybe someone is drinking in the morning after a night of drinking because they start to experience that shakiness, that sweatiness, the uncomfortability, the anxiety. So therefore they use in order to not feel that way anymore. Okay, so now that we know what all the criteria are, how do we diagnose with a substance use disorder? So, in order to diagnose with a substance use disorder, we have to have a client who has experienced at least two of these symptoms over a 12-month period of time. Okay, so the reason why I think that diagnosing substance use disorders is easier, I would say, than others is that a lot of the criteria and the symptoms are behavioral based. So we typically can kind of see them in the story, or we can ask the client directly if they've experienced any of these things. Of course, I also would recommend using clinical assessments to help with diagnosis, which I'm not going to get into too much detail today, but there are many assessments out there that can help us with a substance use diagnosis if we need some extra support for that diagnosis. Um, so, like I said, you have to have at least two criteria over a 12-month period of time. Okay, so the thing with substance use disorders is they have what we call severity specifiers, and we want to include the severity specifier based on the number of criteria met. Okay, so we have three different severity specifiers that we could include: mild, moderate, or severe. Okay, now if I'm going to diagnose with a mild substance use disorder, that person has to meet 2 to 3 criteria. So of those 11 criteria, if they meet 2 to 3, then they would have a substance use disorder mild. Um, Now, when I talk, the other thing I want to take a step back here for a second. Now, when I say substance use disorder, we would want to be specific about what that substance is. Okay, so if I'm talking about alcohol here, alcohol use disorder mild. We're talking about cannabis use disorder mild. Okay, we want to be specific in our diagnosis about what substance it is. Okay, so as I mentioned, 2 to 3 criteria would be a mild severity specifier. So 4 or 5 symptoms would be what we would call a moderate severity specifier. And then anything 6 symptoms or above, we consider that severe. So you've got 11 total criteria. If you meet 6 of them or more, then that would be determined to be a severe substance use disorder. Hopefully, you're feeling a little bit more comfortable about diagnosing substance use disorders. I'll see you next time on Therapist Things with Dr. King.